In 1970, the mayor of Montreal stood in front of his city and made a promise so confident it became a punchline. The Olympic Games, he said, could no more lose money than a man could have a baby. 6 years later, the Games opened in a stadium with no roof and no tower, held up by 3,000 workers running around the clock just to make it to the starting line. And the bill for that promise did not arrive in 1976. It arrived and kept arriving for the next 30 years. A special tax, a slow, grinding debt, the largest cost overrun in the history of the Olympic Games. This is the story of how a 2-week sporting event became a 50-year financial monument, one that even now in 2026 is still being paid for. The building works, the stadium stands. That was never the problem. The problem was the money and who was left holding it. To understand the promise, you have to understand the man who made it and the city that believed him. Montreal in 1970 was riding high. A few years earlier, it had hosted a World's Fair that the world actually remembered, a genuine triumph. Its mayor had willed that fair into existence, had brought a subway and a Major League Baseball team to the city, and seemed to many to be able to walk on water. So when he promised the Olympics would pay for themselves entirely, through tickets and broadcasting and sponsorship, people wanted to believe it. The official estimate for the whole undertaking was modest, somewhere around $120 to $130 million. Self-financing, no deficit, a gift to the city, not a burden. But look closely at that math and the crack is already visible. The revenue from a 2-week event, the seats, the broadcast fees, the sponsors, is a fixed and fairly small pool. The cost of a permanent monumental building is not. The whole promise depended on the second number staying close to the first. It was a beautiful idea and it rested on one assumption, that everything would go according to plan. Nothing about what followed went according to plan. The mayor did not want an ordinary stadium, he wanted a landmark. And to build it, he reached across the Atlantic for a celebrated French architect, a man known for sweeping sculptural concrete. The design was extraordinary, a great ribbed bowl, and rising beside it, the tallest inclined tower in the world leaning out over the field, with cables meant to hoist a retractable roof up and away like a sail. On paper, it was breathtaking. In practice, it was a machine no one had ever built before, using techniques no one had fully tested at a scale no one had attempted. And the architect ran much of it from his office in Paris, an ocean away from the construction site. When you commission a poem in concrete, you are not just buying a shape. You're buying every problem that shape has never had to solve yet. Montreal was about to discover all of them. Every mega project has a tension between 3 things. How good it is, how much it costs, and when it is finished. On most projects, if you fall behind, you can slip the date. An Olympic Games is the one project where you cannot. The date is fixed years in advance, printed on tickets, broadcast to the planet. The athletes are coming whether you are ready or not. Now combine that immovable deadline with an untested design and start 18 months late, which is exactly what happened. Ground was not broken on the Olympic Park until the spring of 1973. From that moment, the city was in a race it had already half lost. And when you cannot move the finish line, and you cannot cut the design your mayor has fallen in love with, there is only one thing left to adjust: money. You throw money at time. And Montreal was about to throw an astonishing amount of it. Then the 1970s did what the 1970s did to everyone. Inflation. The price of structural steel roughly tripled while the stadium was being built. The novel concrete method, precast pieces assembled on site, was slow, finicky, and unforgiving of mistakes. And into that pressure walked Quebec's construction unions, among the most militant on the continent, who could read the situation perfectly. They had a mayor at their mercy, a deadline he could not miss, and every hour of overtime was leverage. In the spring of 1975, with the clock screaming, the workers walked off the job. They did not come back for months, returning only in the autumn, roughly 9 months before the opening ceremony. Every delay now had to be bought back at a premium. Emergency shifts, round-the-clock crews, whatever it took. This is what people who study these disasters call the blank check. When the deadline is sacred and failure is unthinkable, the ones in charge lose the single power that keeps costs honest, the power to walk away, and everyone across the table knows it. The self-financing dream was not dying quietly. It was being dismantled, one strike, one invoice, one overtime slip at a time. And in the middle of all that money moving quickly, some of it went where it should not have. Years later, a provincial commission of inquiry led by a judge named Malouf pulled the whole project apart in public. What it documented was not just incompetence, it was collusion, rigged bids, kickbacks, contracts steered and padded. One of the mayor's most senior officials, the head of the city's powerful executive committee, was convicted of fraud and bribery. A contractor who had won millions in Olympic work had, it emerged, built that same official a private chalet and only produced a bill for it years later when investigators forced his hand. What the commission described was not a few bad apples, but a culture, one in which oversight had been hollowed out and the ordinary checks on public spending had simply been switched off. The mayor himself was never charged with taking a cent, but the commission did not spare him. It faulted him for the incompetence, the lax oversight, the refusal to let anyone check his spending. The architect took his share of the blame too, faulted for a grandiose design and for running the whole thing from an office across the ocean. But the mayor had wanted a monument and had kept the spending in his own hands. He got his monument. It just came with a receipt he never expected to read aloud. July 1976. The world arrived, or most of it. More than 20 African nations stayed home in a boycott over an unrelated political dispute. A reminder that the games were never only about sport. And the stadium was not finished. The great tower was a stump. The roof did not exist. In the final weeks, 3,000 workers labored in shifts around the clock, and in the last hours before the opening ceremony, staff were still sweeping construction debris out of sight of the cameras. When the Queen declared the games open, she did it inside a building that was, by any honest measure, incomplete. And here is the strange, important part. The games themselves were a success. The competition was electric. A teenage gymnast scored the first perfect 10 in Olympic history on a scoreboard that could not even display the number because no one had believed it was possible. For 2 weeks the spectacle worked. That is the cruel trick of it. The event soared, the building stood, and underneath the celebration the bill was already compounding. So let us talk about the number, because the number is historic. Researchers at Oxford who study the cost of every modern Olympics found that Montreal 1976 had the largest cost overrun of any games ever measured, 720% in real terms on its sports-related costs. Not 7%, not 70, 720. A separate engineering case study put the original estimate for the facilities at around $120 million. And the final cost at $1.5 billion, with the main stadium alone near $830 million. The debt from the games came to roughly $1.5 billion. And now remember the promise: self-financing, no deficit. The games could no more lose money than a man could have a baby. Instead, they produced a record no host has beaten since. And here is the part that matters most. And it is not the size of the number, it is who was standing underneath it when it fell. On a private project, when costs explode, the investors lose their money. That is the deal, that is the risk they signed up for. In Montreal, there were no such investors. The guarantee had been made by the public, by the city and the province, which is to say by ordinary people who never saw a contract. So when the bill came, it did not land on a boardroom. It landed on households. The debt was only half the punishment. The building itself kept sending invoices. The tower was not finished until 1987, 11 years after the games it was built for. The retractable roof, when it finally arrived, was a disaster in slow motion. It tore, it leaked, it was hoisted up and it ripped, again and again. In 1991, a 55-ton slab of concrete broke loose and fell, and the resident baseball team had to abandon the rest of its home season. By the following year, they simply stopped trying to open the roof at all. Then in 1999, part of the covering gave way under the weight of snow, while crews were setting up a car show beneath it. A structure meant to fold away like a sail became a fixed, cracked lid that swallowed repair money for decades. Engineers proposed fix after fix. A replacement was studied, shelved, and studied again. By 2010, the covering was judged unsafe outright, and still no permanent answer existed. The stadium had a nickname now. The Big O had become the Big OA. How do you pay off a debt like that, slowly and from an unexpected pocket? The province had introduced a special tax on tobacco back in 1976, and that tax became the main engine of repayment, cigarette by cigarette, year after year. It took 3 decades. The final payment did not clear until 2006, 30 years after the closing ceremony. There is a small dark irony buried in the timing. As the finish line finally came into view, an indoor smoking ban cut into the very tax revenue that was retiring the debt, nudging the last payment a little later still. In nominal terms, the final bill came in at something like 13 times the original estimate. A different way of counting than the Oxford figure, but pointing at the same truth. A generation of Quebecers paid for a party they may not even have attended. Children who were not born in 1976 helped clear its debt. You might think the story ends in 2006 with the debt finally gone. It does not. The roof, that cursed roof, was declared unsafe, and by the 2020s it had more than 20,000 tears in it. So the province committed to replacing it, again. In early 2024, the government announced a new roof project valued at around $870 million, with a construction contract signed at just over $729 million. The old roof came down, a new one is being assembled and raised, and the stadium is scheduled to reopen in 2028. The tower, meanwhile, got its own long, over-budget renovation, its cost climbing past $120 million, well beyond the original plan and years behind schedule. The province makes a case for all of this, and it is not a foolish one. A working, weatherproof roof, they argue, finally lets the stadium earn its keep, hosting concerts and major events year-round, drawing millions of visitors and tens of millions in new activity. Maybe. That is the bet. But notice its shape, which means that in 2026, on the 50th anniversary of the games it was built for, Quebecers are once again writing checks for a building that opened unfinished half a century ago. The debt ended, the spending never did. So what is the lesson of the Big O? It is not that the stadium is ugly or useless. It stands, it fills, it will host again. The lesson is about the shape of the failure, because it is a shape you see again and again. Take a fixed deadline you cannot move. Add a design chosen for prestige rather than feasibility. Remove real cost control because the person in charge has promised there will be no problem. Then let inflation, delay, leverage, and a little corruption do their work. The result is not a building that fails. It is a building that succeeds technically while quietly ruining the finances of whoever guaranteed it. We have seen this before on this channel, a tunnel that worked and bankrupted its owners. Montreal is the public version. Here the guarantor was not a group of investors. It was the taxpayers themselves. A man cannot have a baby. But a city, it turns out, can carry a debt for 30 years and then start paying all over again.